Alexander had grown up in a world that most people could only dream about. The palace was not just a place to live. It was a universe filled with history, grandeur, and secrets. Every corner had a story. Every corridor echoed with whispers of the past, and every room held objects that had been treasured for centuries. He had learned early on to walk quietly, to observe without interrupting, and to understand that wealth and power came with invisible rules. Yet no matter how much he knew about the palace, there was one thing that always captured his imagination more than anything else: the Queen's jewels. From the first time Alexander saw them, he was fascinated. He remembered standing in a bright, elegant room with high ceilings, walls lined with portraits of ancestors he barely knew, and in the center, displayed under soft lights, were the most beautiful pieces of jewelry he had ever seen. Crowns glimmered with diamonds that seemed to hold their own light. Necklaces shimmered with emeralds and sapphires that caught the eye in a way that felt almost magical, and brooches sparkled with gems so fine that he could hardly believe they were real. To Alexander, these were not just objects. They were symbols of a world he admired and desired. As a child, he had approached them with the reverence one might give to a religious relic. He listened as the staff told stories of how the gems had been passed down through generations, how each piece had a history filled with triumphs, scandals, and mysteries. It all fascinated him. But as Alexander grew older, his fascination began to change. The awe remained, but a quiet, dangerous curiosity began to take root. He wanted to touch them, to feel their weight, to know what it would be like to hold something that had been in the hands of kings and queens. It was a thought he quickly pushed aside, knowing it was impossible, unthinkable even. Still, it lingered. Alexander was not reckless, at least not openly. He was careful in public, always polite, always attentive to the rules. But behind the polished manners, he was learning about desire and temptation. He watched the guards, studied their routines, and noticed the tiny gaps in the security system. He began to understand the rhythms of the palace, the quiet hours, the moments when a corridor might be less watched, the times when curiosity could creep close to danger. It was a thrilling realization, one that made him feel clever and alive. The palace, so vast and imposing, suddenly seemed a little less untouchable. He started spending more time near the areas where the jewels were kept, under the guise of interest in history and art. He asked questions about the gems, about their origins, about the families who had owned them. The staff, used to his polite curiosity, answered patiently, unaware of the deeper interest behind his questions. Alexander learned about the value of patience, of observing without moving too quickly, and of knowing when to retreat. Every small piece of information made him feel more powerful, more in control. It was a subtle game, one that he had learned to play well. Alexander's fascination was not shared by his friends. They were interested in sports, music, or social media trends, but he preferred the quiet study of history, the careful watching of human behavior, and the secret thrill of being close to something forbidden. Sometimes he felt lonely in his obsession, but that loneliness only deepened his connection to the jewels. They became his private fascination, a secret world he could explore safely within his own mind. As time went on, Alexander began to imagine what it would be like to have the jewels in his hands, if only for a moment. He would think about the sparkle of diamonds, the depth of sapphires, the warmth of gold. He imagined turning each piece over in his fingers, feeling the craftsmanship, the weight, the history. It was a dangerous fantasy, one that made his pulse quicken and filled him with a mix of excitement and fear. Yet he told himself it was harmless, just a dream, a way to pass the hours in his mind. The palace itself seemed to encourage his curiosity. It was full of hidden doors, secret passageways, and long corridors that twisted and turned in unexpected ways. He had learned to move through them with ease, to notice when a door was left slightly open, when a guard's attention wavered, when the sun hit a particular window just right. Each observation felt like a small victory, a chance to understand the palace better, to feel a connection to the history around him. It was intoxicating, and it slowly built a sense of confidence in him. He began to believe that he could be trusted, that his access to the inner circles made him almost untouchable. But Alexander's curiosity was not just about the jewels themselves. It was about what they represented. They were a symbol of power, of legacy, of a world that was both alluring and dangerous. He wanted to understand that world, to feel what it meant to be part of it, even if only as an observer. The jewels were the key to that understanding, and the more he thought about them, the more he realized that he wanted to get closer than anyone had ever allowed. One evening, as the sun set and the palace halls were bathed in a soft golden light, Alexander found himself in the room where the queen's most precious gems were displayed. He stood at the edge, his hands folded, his eyes wide with admiration. The staff had left the room briefly, and for a moment he was alone with the jewels. He felt a thrill, a rush of excitement mixed with fear. This was as close as he had ever been, and the experience was almost overwhelming. The diamonds sparkled as if alive. The sapphires seemed to hold the depth of the ocean, and the gold glimmered with a warmth that made him ache with desire. In that moment, Alexander realized something important. He understood that fascination and obsession were different, that admiration could easily turn into temptation if he wasn't careful. He told himself to step back, to remember the rules, to respect the legacy of the jewels. Yet even as he did, a small, daring thought crept into his mind. What if he could hold them just once, just for a second? What would it feel like to touch history, to feel the weight of centuries in his hands? It was a thought that both thrilled and terrified him, and he knew that it would not go away easily. Alexander left the room that evening with a mixture of awe and apprehension. He walked through the quiet halls, his mind racing with possibilities and what-ifs. He had learned a lot about the palace, about the guards, about the routines and the secrets. He had learned about himself, about his desires, about the thin line between admiration and temptation. And he had learned that the world of the Queen's jewels was not just about beauty and wealth, but about power, responsibility, and respect. As he lay in bed that night, Alexander thought about the jewels again. He imagined them sparkling under the soft lights, each piece telling a story, each gem holding a secret. He knew that his fascination was only growing, and that one day he would have to confront what that fascination really meant. But for now, it was enough to dream, to imagine, and to feel the thrill of being close to something so extraordinary. The jewels were safe for now, and so was he. But deep down, Alexander knew that his curiosity was only the beginning of a story that would challenge everything he had ever known about privilege, temptation, and the thin line between admiration and desire. Alexander spent the next few weeks walking through the palace halls with a quiet intensity. He watched the guards carefully, noting their movements, their shifts, and even the small moments when they looked away for a second. The palace was a maze of secrets, and he had grown more familiar with it than anyone outside the inner circle could ever be. He began thinking in terms of patterns. Which doors were locked at which times, how often a guard would pass by a certain corridor, and which areas were rarely visited. Every detail mattered. He knew he had to be careful. This was not a game. This was the palace, a place of rules and traditions that had stood for centuries. Yet in the quiet of his private moments, he allowed himself to imagine possibilities. The jewels, with all their brilliance, had become a private obsession. He imagined feeling the smooth metal of a crown, the coolness of a diamond on his fingertips, the weight of history in his hands. It was a thought that thrilled him and frightened him at the same time. To prepare, Alexander started asking more questions about the jewels, but always under the guise of curiosity about history. He spoke with staff who had worked in the palace for decades, listening to their stories, learning about the way the rooms were arranged and discovering small, almost invisible details that could make a difference. Some of the staff were wary of his interest, but most simply smiled and indulged him, unaware that his fascination was beginning to shift toward something more daring. He began sketching maps in his mind, mentally tracing paths through corridors, noting which doors could be accessed easily and which required keys or codes. He imagined the layout of the room where the most precious jewels were kept, picturing the cases, the lighting, and the guards. Every day he rehearsed the movements in his mind, visualizing himself moving through the palace with quiet confidence, avoiding attention, and coming closer to the jewels he so admired. Alexander also spent time observing the staff routines. He noticed which guards were more alert and which ones tended to relax at certain times. He paid attention to the cleaning schedules, the moments when rooms were empty for maintenance, and even the times when the queen herself might be walking through the halls. It was all part of understanding the rhythm of the palace, learning to anticipate the movements of everyone around him. The thrill of planning, the careful thought required, became a game in itself. At night, he would lie in bed replaying the day's observations. He imagined scenarios where he could move closer to the jewels without being noticed, considering every possible outcome, from success to being caught. It was a mental exercise, a mixture of fear and excitement, and it began to occupy much of his time. The palace, which had once felt like a place of safe admiration, now felt like a challenge full of hidden opportunities and quiet dangers. Alexander began thinking about timing. He understood that a mistake of even a second could change everything. He practiced moving quietly, imagining the sound of his footsteps on marble floors, the soft click of a door, the slight shift of a case lid. He learned to control his breathing, to slow his pulse, to focus his mind entirely on the task he imagined. Each mental rehearsal made him feel more prepared, more confident, and strangely more alive. He also thought about the risks. If he were caught, the consequences could be severe. He could be expelled from certain areas of the palace, shunned by staff, and even face legal repercussions. Yet there was a part of him that felt the risk added to the excitement. He understood the difference between a harmless dream and a dangerous desire, but he couldn't help feeling drawn toward testing his own boundaries. Alexander began to notice small details that others overlooked. He saw the tiny scratches on door handles, the slight looseness of a lock, the way a guard's attention wavered for just a moment when distracted. These were not accidents. They were opportunities, and in his mind he began piecing together a plan, a step-by-step route that could take him closer to the jewels than anyone had allowed before. He also considered timing in relation to visitors. Sometimes the palace was busy with official events, and other times it was quiet and still. He learned to identify the quiet periods when fewer people were around, and the corridors were nearly empty. These moments became the most important in his calculations. They were the only times when his imagination could become reality, if only for a brief moment. Alexander's fascination grew with each day. He began to see the jewels not just as objects, but as a challenge, a puzzle to understand. Their beauty was undeniable, but what excited him more was the idea of reaching them, of moving through the palace in a way that had never been done before. It was no longer just about admiration. It was about testing his intelligence, his skill, and his ability to navigate a world built on rules he had always respected. He also reflected on the meaning of the jewels themselves. They were symbols of history, power, and tradition. Each piece had been worn by someone important, had witnessed events that shaped the nation, and had been cared for meticulously. Alexander realized that touching them was not just a personal thrill. It was an intrusion into centuries of legacy. This awareness made his fascination even more intense and also added a layer of fear. The thought that he could be breaking the trust of the royal family added weight to every imagined step. During this time, Alexander also started observing his own feelings. He noticed how his pulse quickened when he imagined moving closer, how his mind raced with possibilities, and how he could feel both guilt and excitement simultaneously. It was a strange mixture of emotions, one that he had never felt before. He knew that he was venturing into dangerous mental territory, but he also felt a sense of purpose. This was more than curiosity. It was a test of himself. He began to keep a quiet journal, recording observations, ideas, and plans, though never in writing that could be discovered. Each entry was a reflection on what he had seen, what he had imagined, and what he hoped to achieve. The process of writing helped him organize his thoughts, refine his plans, and consider every possible outcome. It became a private ritual, a way to prepare mentally for a challenge that existed only in his imagination for now. Alexander also began to notice how the palace responded to him. Staff were polite, guards were courteous, and doors seemed to open for him in ways they might not for others. He interpreted these small gestures as signs of trust, signs that he could move carefully and observe without being suspected. This perception, whether accurate or not, encouraged him to continue his planning, to trust his instincts, and to refine his understanding of the palace's rhythms. He spent long hours imagining scenarios, rehearsing movements, and thinking about contingencies. He imagined the guards noticing him, the jewels glinting under the lights, and the exact steps he would take to avoid detection. Every imagined detail brought him closer to understanding the risks and rewards, and every rehearsal made him more confident in his own abilities. It was a delicate balance between fear and excitement, one that he found addictive. As the days passed, Alexander's mental preparation became more structured. He began breaking down his imaginary plan into phases, observing, approaching, pausing, retreating, and retreating safely if needed. Each phase was designed to minimize risk while maximizing understanding. He imagined himself moving like a shadow, unnoticed but aware, alert to every sound, every reflection, every subtle cue. It was a game of strategy, patience, and observation. Despite the growing obsession, Alexander also remained cautious. He reminded himself constantly that these were thoughts, not actions, and that crossing the line could have consequences he was not ready to face. The thrill of planning was tempered by a sense of responsibility and respect for the legacy around him. He understood that the jewels were more than objects. They were symbols of a world built on trust, duty, and history. Through all of this, Alexander's fascination with the jewels deepened, becoming a mixture of admiration, desire, and challenge. He had learned to observe, to plan, and to think strategically. He had learned about patience, about subtlety, and about the delicate balance between risk and reward. And he had discovered something else, that the mind could create adventures and challenges as real as any physical action, and that preparation, careful thought, and imagination could be just as thrilling as the act itself. By the end of the weeks of preparation, Alexander felt a mix of excitement and anxiety. He had gathered knowledge, rehearsed movements, and imagined countless scenarios. He understood the risks, respected the rules, and yet felt an undeniable pull toward the challenge. The jewels remained untouchable, but his mind had brought him closer than he had ever been. The stage was set, the plan taking shape in his imagination, and Alexander could feel that the next step, whenever it came, would test everything he had learned about himself, about the palace, and about the fine line between curiosity and temptation. The night Alexander had been imagining for weeks finally arrived. The palace was quiet, with only the soft hum of the heating and the occasional creak of an old floorboard breaking the silence. It was a night when he knew there would be fewer people, fewer guards patrolling the hallways. He had observed the routine carefully and chosen this moment with precision. Every detail he had studied, every scenario he had rehearsed in his mind, now mattered more than ever. Alexander moved slowly, almost holding his breath as he walked through the corridors. The marble floors reflected the faint light of the lamps, casting long shadows along the walls. He felt a mix of excitement and tension, his pulse quickening as he approached the area where the queen's most treasured jewels were kept. Each step was measured, careful, and deliberate. He reminded himself to stay calm, to focus on his breathing, and to notice every sound around him. He reached the room where the jewels were displayed. It was more magnificent than he had imagined. The cases glimmered under the soft lighting, each piece catching the eye like it had a life of its own. Crowns, necklaces, brooches, and rings sparkled, and the air seemed to hold the weight of history. Alexander stood for a moment at the doorway, feeling the thrill of being so close and the fear of being discovered. The room was empty, or so he thought. Alexander's hand brushed lightly over the door handle, careful not to make a sound. He stepped inside, the floor cold beneath his shoes. He moved slowly, almost floating, as if each step might awaken the past itself. The jewels were even more magnificent up close, and he felt a strange mix of reverence and temptation. He reached out a hand, almost touching the smooth glass of a display case, and imagined lifting a diamond crown. The fantasy was vivid, and it made his heart race. He began to circle the room, careful to stay out of the direct lines of sight from the guards' usual positions. He had memorized the patrol patterns and knew when he had the briefest moments of safety. He crouched behind a small column to watch a security camera, timing his movements with the soft blinking of its light. Every detail mattered. The thrill of moving unnoticed, combined with the beauty of the jewels, made him feel alive in a way that nothing else had before. As he admired a necklace of sapphires, Alexander heard a faint sound that made him freeze. It was soft, almost imperceptible, but enough to make him pause. The sound of a footstep echoed slightly differently than he expected. He pressed himself against a wall, heart pounding, and waited. The guards were known for their precision, and even a second of inattention could ruin everything. He held his breath, trying to calm the surge of fear and excitement that coursed through him. Then, to his relief, it was only the staff checking the room. They moved quietly, methodically, and soon left without noticing his presence. Alexander let out a quiet sigh. feeling a mixture of relief and renewed determination. He continued his careful exploration, mentally noting each case, each display, and each subtle detail of the room. His imagination ran wild with possibilities, but he kept reminding himself to stay focused, to observe, and not to cross any lines just yet. He found a case that held some of the most exquisite rings he had ever seen. He knelt down to get a better look, studying the intricate designs, the precise cuts of each gemstone, and the craftsmanship that had gone into every piece. He could feel the history in the room, as if each jewel was a silent witness to centuries of royalty. Alexander realized that the jewels were more than objects, they were stories, and he was standing in a room where those stories lived. Alexander moved closer to a crown that had always fascinated him. Its diamonds glimmered like tiny stars, and he imagined the weight of it in his hands. The thought was intoxicating, and he had to resist the urge to touch it. He reminded himself that he was here to observe, to understand, and to test his ability to navigate the palace without detection. The jewels were safe for now, and that was the most important thing. As he continued moving, he noticed a small gap in the routine he had studied. A guard was approaching the room faster than expected, a patrol schedule slightly off from what he had memorized. Alexander's heart raced. He pressed himself against the far wall, flattening himself as much as possible, and held his breath. The guard walked by the doorway, eyes scanning, and for a tense moment it seemed as if the slightest movement would give him away, but the guard continued past, and Alexander allowed himself a quiet internal sigh of relief. He realized then how close he had come to being discovered. The thrill of the moment was mixed with a sobering awareness of the risks. He had imagined this scenario countless times, but now that it was real, he understood that the palace was alive with unpredictability. A single misstep could change everything. The awareness sharpened his senses, making him more alert, more careful, and more respectful of the space around him. Alexander continued his careful exploration, moving from display to display, mentally cataloging each piece. He noticed the craftsmanship, the history, and even the subtle security features built into each case. It was fascinating and terrifying at the same time. The jewels were not just beautiful, they were protected, monitored, and respected by people who understood their value far beyond their monetary worth. Alexander felt a growing respect for the staff and the rules that had kept these treasures safe for centuries. He also thought about the consequences of being caught. He imagined the disappointment in his family, the embarrassment, and the potential legal repercussions. The thought was enough to keep him cautious, reminding him that admiration had boundaries and temptation had limits. Alexander understood that the line between fascination and obsession was thin, and he had to navigate it carefully. As he approached a particularly stunning brooch, Alexander allowed himself a moment of quiet reflection. He admired the precision of the design, the way the gems caught the light, and the story it might tell. He imagined the people who had owned it, the events it had witnessed, and the care that had gone into preserving it. The moment was almost spiritual, a quiet connection across centuries. It reminded him that the jewels were more than objects of desire. They were symbols of history, legacy, and responsibility. Just as he was about to leave the room, he heard a sound that made his heart stop. A guard making an unplanned inspection had entered from the other side. Alexander froze, pressed himself against the nearest wall, and held his breath. Every muscle in his body tensed as he watched the guard move, his eyes scanning the room with a careful precision that made Alexander realize how closely he had been watched all along. For a moment it seemed as if the guard might notice him. Alexander's mind raced, thinking of every possible excuse, every possible explanation. But the guard's attention was focused on the cases, on checking the locks, and Alexander remained unnoticed. He waited, counting silently until the guard finished the inspection and left the room. Only then did he allow himself to breathe again, his heart pounding with relief and exhilaration. The close encounter left Alexander shaken but also more aware. He realized that the palace was full of unpredictability, and no amount of planning could account for every moment. The thrill of being close to the jewels was intense, but so was the risk. He understood that curiosity and respect had to coexist, and that the line between observation and intrusion was fragile. The experience had tested his patience, his courage, and his understanding of the world he had admired from a distance. Alexander finally left the room, moving slowly through the quiet corridors. The thrill of the experience lingered, a mix of excitement, fear, and respect. He understood that the jewels were not just objects of beauty, they were symbols of trust, history, and responsibility. He had been close, almost too close, and the experience had changed him. He had learned about patience, observation, and the careful balance between desire and respect. As he walked back to his quarters, Alexander reflected on what he had learned. The palace was a place of rules and traditions, of trust and history. The jewels were safe, but the experience had brought him closer to understanding their true value. It was not just the beauty that mattered, it was the legacy, the stories, and the responsibility of keeping them safe. Alexander realized that fascination was powerful, but it had to be tempered with respect, patience, and awareness. That night, as he lay in bed, Alexander replayed every detail of the evening. The close encounter with the guard, the careful observation of each piece, and the thrill of moving through the palace undetected, all merged into a vivid memory. He understood that he had been tested, that his curiosity had been challenged, and that he had learned more about himself than about the jewels. The experience had changed him, sharpening his awareness, his patience, and his respect for the world he had long admired. The jewels remained untouchable, safe under the watchful eyes of the palace staff. But Alexander's understanding had grown. He had seen the beauty, felt the thrill of proximity, and faced the tension of potential discovery. He had learned about risk, responsibility, and the delicate balance between curiosity and respect. And as he drifted off to sleep, he knew that the story was far from over. The jewels were still there, waiting, and Alexander's fascination, tempered now with caution and understanding, was ready for the next chapter. The following days after Alexander's close encounter were filled with a mixture of relief, anxiety, and reflection. He had come dangerously close to being discovered, and the memory of the guard's unexpected entry remained vivid in his mind. Every time he walked through the palace, he felt the weight of responsibility, a new awareness of the rules and the people who enforced them. He had learned firsthand that fascination could become risky if not tempered with caution and respect. Alexander spent a lot of time thinking about what had happened. He replayed the night in his mind, recalling every step, every movement, every sound. He realized how lucky he had been, how small details had worked in his favor, and how quickly things could have turned against him. The experience was both humbling and enlightening. It was a lesson in patience, observation, and the importance of respecting boundaries. He understood that the palace was more than just a setting for his curiosity. It was a living, breathing space with rules, routines, and people who ensured its safety. He also reflected on his own feelings during the encounter. The thrill of being close to the jewels had been intense, but so had the fear. The mixture of emotions had left him both exhilarated and cautious. Alexander realized that desire could be powerful, but it could also cloud judgment. The experience had taught him to balance admiration with respect, curiosity with caution, and fantasy with reality. The palace staff continued their routines, unaware of how close Alexander had come to breaking trust. Guards moved through the halls with precision, checking doors and display cases, ensuring that everything was secure. The staff's dedication impressed Alexander, and he began to see the jewels not just as objects of beauty, but as symbols of responsibility and legacy. He felt a growing respect for the people who worked tirelessly to protect them, understanding that their vigilance was what kept centuries of history intact. Alexander also thought about the stories behind the jewels. Each piece had witnessed events, celebrated triumphs, and endured challenges. They were not just objects. They were witnesses to history, carrying the weight of generations. The experience of being close to them made Alexander feel connected to that history, but it also reminded him of the importance of trust and respect. The jewels were safe because people valued them and understood their significance. He began to consider how his actions, even imagined, could have consequences. The palace was a place where rules were clear, and breaking them could lead to serious outcomes. Alexander reflected on the thin line between curiosity and intrusion, realizing that crossing it could harm not just himself, but the relationships and trust he valued. The experience had taught him about the importance of responsibility, patience, and ethical behavior. Alexander's family also noticed subtle changes in his behavior. He seemed more thoughtful, more aware, and more respectful of boundaries. They observed that he spent time in reflection, that he approached his interest with care, and that he had learned to value patience and observation over impulsive action. The experience had not only changed his understanding of the palace and the jewels, but also his personal growth and maturity. He also began to appreciate the palace in a new way. The corridors, the rooms, and the hidden spaces were no longer just areas to navigate. They were part of a complex system of care, tradition, and history. Alexander's observations had taught him that the palace was not just about wealth or privilege, but about stewardship, respect, and understanding. Every careful movement, every observation, and every moment of reflection reinforced the lessons he had learned. During this period, Alexander focused on learning rather than acting. He continued to observe patterns, ask questions about history, and understand the significance of the jewels, but he did so with a sense of respect and responsibility. The close encounter with the guard had reminded him that admiration and desire needed to coexist with ethics and caution. He learned that true understanding came not from possession, but from observation, reflection, and respect. Alexander also thought about the future. He understood that his fascination with the jewels was not going away, but he began to see it in a new light. Instead of focusing on physical proximity, he valued knowledge, understanding, and connection. The jewels represented history, responsibility, and trust, and he realized that the greatest respect he could offer was to honor those values. This shift in perspective marked a turning point in his growth, highlighting the importance of ethics, maturity, and self-awareness. He spent time speaking with staff about the history of the palace, the significance of the jewels, and the care required to protect them. These conversations deepened his appreciation for the dedication and expertise of the people who worked behind the scenes. Alexander realized that his previous fascination had been limited to the surface beauty of the jewels, but now he understood the deeper layers of meaning, responsibility, and legacy. This knowledge transformed his curiosity into respect and admiration. The incident also taught Alexander about human nature, vigilance, and the balance between risk and reward. He recognized that the palace was a place where rules existed for a reason, and that even privilege did not exempt one from responsibility. The experience had tested his patience, ethics, and self-control, and he had emerged with a stronger sense of awareness and respect. Alexander understood that his fascination could coexist with ethical behavior, if guided by understanding, caution, and responsibility. In the quiet moments, Alexander reflected on the lessons of the near discovery. He thought about the trust placed in him, the dedication of the staff, and the significance of the jewels. He realized that fascination and desire were natural, but they needed to be balanced with ethical awareness and respect for rules and boundaries. The experience had given him a new perspective on responsibility, privilege, and the importance of thoughtful observation. Alexander also considered the emotional aspects of the experience. He acknowledged the excitement, fear, and thrill he had felt, but he also recognized the value of patience, reflection, and self-control. The incident had shown him that true understanding and connection did not come from impulsive action, but from careful observation, learning, and respect. This realization became a guiding principle for his future behavior. He began to plan ways to channel his fascination into constructive pursuits. Instead of focusing on physical proximity to the jewels, he considered studying history, learning about craftsmanship, and understanding the significance of legacy. Alexander realized that knowledge, appreciation, and ethical engagement were more valuable than possession or reckless action. This shift in focus marked a significant step in his personal growth and maturity. Alexander's relationships with his family also evolved. They noticed his increased thoughtfulness, maturity, and respect for rules. The experience had fostered a sense of responsibility and ethical awareness that was evident in his interactions and behavior. The close encounter with the guard had been a turning point, teaching him about the importance of trust, respect, and understanding consequences. He also spent time reflecting on the palace staff and their dedication. Their vigilance, attention to detail, and commitment to preserving history had impressed him deeply. Alexander realized that the safety of the jewels was not just about security measures, but about the human effort and care invested in protecting them. This awareness deepened his respect for the palace, its rules, and the people who upheld them. Through all of this, Alexander's fascination with the jewels remained, but it was transformed. It was no longer driven solely by desire or curiosity, but by respect, understanding, and ethical engagement. He recognized that true connection to history, legacy, and beauty came from careful observation, reflection, and responsible action. The experience had taught him about the balance between admiration and temptation, curiosity and responsibility. As days turned into weeks, Alexander continued to navigate the palace with a renewed sense of awareness. He observed patterns, studied history, and engaged with the staff, all while maintaining a respectful distance from the jewels. The experience had left an indelible mark on him, shaping his understanding of ethics, responsibility, and the importance of thoughtful engagement with the world around him. Alexander's near discovery had been a powerful lesson. It had tested his curiosity, his patience, and his understanding of risk and reward. It had taught him about human nature, responsibility, and the value of respect. Most importantly, it had transformed his fascination into admiration guided by ethics, reflection, and awareness. The jewels remained safe, but Alexander had grown in ways that were more valuable than any object could ever be. He had learned the true meaning of trust, responsibility, and the delicate balance between desire and respect, a lesson that would guide him for the rest of his life. Alexander had spent weeks reflecting on the events and lessons that the palace had offered him. The close encounter with the guard, the allure of the jewels, and the vast halls of history all remained vivid in his mind. But more than fascination, what lingered now was a sense of understanding. He realized that the world he had admired from a distance was complex, full of rules, expectations, and stories that demanded respect. The palace felt different to him now. It was still grand, still beautiful, but he noticed subtleties he had overlooked before. The way the light fell on the walls, the quiet dedication of the staff, the rhythm of the guards' patrols, all of it seemed like part of a living system that required balance, attention, and care. Alexander understood that he had been given a unique perspective, a chance to witness the careful stewardship of history and tradition. This knowledge carried weight, responsibility, and an awareness that was far greater than any mere desire for the jewels. He began to find joy in observation rather than possession. Alexander spent time learning about the history of each gem, reading stories about the occasions they had been worn, the events they had witnessed, and the people who had cared for them. Every story deepened his appreciation, and he realized that the beauty of the jewels lay not just in their sparkle, but in the human effort and the passage of time that had preserved them. Each gem was a lesson, a reflection of diligence, dedication, and legacy. Alexander also reflected on himself. He understood that curiosity was natural, but it required guidance. The desire to reach for what was forbidden could be strong, but he had learned to balance that impulse with patience, respect, and careful thought. He recognized that maturity was not just about following rules, but about understanding their purpose and valuing the trust that came with privilege. This realization helped him see the palace and its treasures in a new light. He found that his interactions with the staff had changed, too. Conversations about history, traditions, and the significance of the jewels became moments of learning. He listened carefully, asked thoughtful questions, and valued the insights of those who had dedicated their lives to preserving the palace's legacy. These connections deepened his respect for the people around him and gave him a sense of belonging without overstepping boundaries. Alexander realized that engagement, understanding, and ethical curiosity could be just as rewarding as physical proximity. Alexander also began to appreciate the intangible lessons of the experience. The tension of his near discovery had taught him about awareness, timing, and the importance of focus. He understood that life, like the palace, required attention to detail, careful planning, and respect for others. The jewels were not just objects of desire. They were symbols of responsibility, patience, and ethical understanding. Alexander began to carry these lessons into his daily life, applying the principles he had learned to his behavior, decisions, and interactions. As days turned into weeks, Alexander found that his fascination had matured into admiration. The thrill of imagining possession had faded, replaced by a deeper understanding of history, responsibility, and trust. He began to see the jewels as teachers rather than temptations, guiding him toward a greater awareness of human effort, legacy, and ethics. Alexander realized that the true value of the jewels lay not in their physical beauty, but in the lessons they represented. He also reflected on the concept of legacy. The palace, the jewels, and the staff were all part of a continuum, a chain of responsibility stretching across generations. Alexander understood that being part of this world meant more than privilege. It meant understanding the importance of stewardship, of caring for what had been entrusted to you, and of respecting the trust placed in you. This awareness shaped his perspective on life, making him more thoughtful, deliberate, and conscious of his actions. Alexander's personal growth became evident in subtle ways. He approached his interests with patience, engaged in thoughtful observation, and valued knowledge over immediate gratification. He recognized the importance of self-control and the satisfaction of learning and understanding rather than taking or possessing. The experience had strengthened his character, teaching him that true respect and admiration were rooted in ethical behavior and awareness. He continued to explore the palace, not as someone testing limits, but as someone learning from them. The halls, rooms, and corridors became spaces of reflection and study, filled with stories waiting to be understood. Alexander appreciated the rhythm of the palace, the dedication of the staff, and the care with which every detail was managed. He found beauty not only in the jewels but in the entire ecosystem that preserved history and tradition. Alexander also reflected on the nature of temptation and desire. He realized that these feelings were not inherently wrong, but they required guidance and understanding. The jewels had been a mirror, showing him both the allure of the forbidden and the importance of ethical boundaries. He recognized that his growth came not from avoiding curiosity, but from learning how to channel it responsibly, transforming fascination into admiration and impulse into thoughtful engagement. Over time, Alexander felt a quiet pride in his growth. He had faced challenges, navigated temptation, and learned lessons that would guide him for the rest of his life. The palace had offered him a unique opportunity, and he had emerged with a deeper understanding of responsibility, trust, and respect. He realized that the true treasures of the palace were not just the jewels but the knowledge, ethics, and human effort that preserved them. He also began to see his relationship with the palace as one of stewardship rather than privilege. Every observation, every story, every moment of reflection reinforced the idea that understanding and respect were more valuable than possession. Alexander felt a connection to the history and legacy around him, a sense of purpose and awareness that transcended desire. He understood that true engagement with the world required care, attention, and ethical consideration. Alexander's fascination had transformed into a form of reverence. He admired the jewels not for their value, but for the lessons they represented. Each piece became a symbol of patience, responsibility, and human effort. He recognized that the world around him was filled with stories, lessons, and opportunities to learn, and that ethical engagement was the path to understanding and growth. As he continued to reflect, Alexander understood that his journey was not just about the jewels or the palace, but about personal growth. The experience had taught him about observation, patience, respect, and ethical behavior. It had shown him the importance of understanding consequences, valuing trust, and appreciating the human effort behind every legacy. Alexander realized that these lessons were far more valuable than any material object, shaping his character, decisions, and perspective on life. In the quiet moments, Alexander often returned to the rooms where the jewels were displayed. He admired them from a distance, reflecting on their history, significance, and the care that preserved them. He felt a sense of peace knowing that the jewels were safe and that he had learned the true meaning of admiration, responsibility, and ethical engagement. The experience had transformed him, leaving a lasting impact that would guide him for years to come. Alexander also considered the future. He understood that his fascination would never entirely disappear, but it had evolved into a respect for history, responsibility, and legacy. He recognized that true fulfillment came from understanding, observation, and ethical engagement rather than possession. The lessons of the palace, the jewels, and the near discovery would remain with him, shaping his character, decisions, and values. In the end, Alexander realized that the most important treasures were not the jewels themselves, but the wisdom and growth he had gained from the experience. He understood that privilege came with responsibility, curiosity required guidance, and admiration demanded respect. The palace had offered him a lesson far greater than mere fascination. It had taught him about ethics, legacy, and the enduring value of knowledge, reflection, and responsibility. Alexander's journey concluded with a deep sense of understanding. He had faced temptation, navigated risk, and emerged with a stronger sense of self. The jewels remained untouched, safe, and admired. But Alexander had discovered a greater treasure within himself: the ability to balance curiosity with ethics, desire with respect, and fascination with responsibility. The lessons of the palace, the guard, and the jewels had transformed him, leaving a lasting impression that would guide his actions, decisions, and understanding for the rest of his life. Even though Alexander had learned to channel his fascination into respect and admiration, the palace continued to teach him lessons in ways he had not expected. The experience of almost being discovered had left a permanent mark on him, sharpening his awareness and encouraging him to observe the world with patience and care. Each day brought new insights, new stories, and subtle challenges that required him to apply the lessons he had learned. He spent time walking through parts of the palace that were often overlooked, the corridors and rooms that held hidden histories. Each corner told a story. The worn floorboards spoke of countless footsteps over centuries. The faint markings on doors hinted at repairs made with careful precision, and the quiet hum of old lighting carried echoes of past events. Alexander began to understand that the palace was alive in its own way, each detail a reminder of human effort, responsibility, and history. In these quiet moments, Alexander thought about the nature of curiosity. He realized that curiosity was a powerful force. It could drive learning, creativity, and understanding, but it also required discipline. The jewels had been the first test of his ability to balance desire and restraint. Now Alexander found ways to channel his curiosity into constructive exploration. He read manuscripts, studied art, and learned the stories behind the tapestries and furniture, discovering lessons in patience, observation, and respect that extended far beyond his initial fascination. Alexander also noticed the subtle ways in which the palace shaped those who spent time there. The staff, guards, and caretakers approached their duties with a mix of pride, precision, and care that left a deep impression on him. Their dedication was inspiring, showing him that responsibility was not merely about rules, but about honor, respect, and understanding the consequences of one's actions. Alexander realized that his earlier desires had been naive, but the lessons he had learned were real and lasting. One afternoon, Alexander found himself in a small, rarely visited room filled with old documents and photographs. He spent hours studying the papers, learning about the lives of those who had lived and worked in the palace, their contributions, struggles, and moments of triumph. Each story added depth to his understanding, and he realized that history was not just preserved in jewels or artifacts, but in the human experiences that surrounded them. Alexander felt a growing sense of humility, recognizing the importance of observing, learning, and valuing the efforts of others. As he continued his exploration, Alexander began to think about the responsibility of knowledge. To know about the palace, its history, and the jewels was a privilege, and he understood that privilege came with an expectation to act wisely. He reflected on his near discovery and recognized that the lessons of restraint, patience, and respect were not temporary. They would guide him throughout life. Alexander understood that curiosity was most valuable when tempered by ethics and awareness, and that true understanding required both knowledge and responsibility. The palace also provided Alexander with unexpected moments of reflection on human behavior. He observed the interactions between staff and guards, witnessing moments of kindness, vigilance, and subtle negotiation of authority. He realized that trust was built over time, and that it could be strengthened or broken in an instant. Alexander understood that his own actions, thoughts, and decisions were part of this larger web, and that his growth depended on being mindful, ethical, and patient. During his quiet walks, Alexander often thought about the jewels again, but now in a different light. He admired them not for their beauty or potential thrill, but for the stories they carried, the human effort invested in their preservation, and the responsibility that